What would you do if you watched your entire world disappear in a single day? What keeps a human being alive when death seems like mercy? And what if I told you that in the darkest place on earth I found something so unexpected, so impossible, that it changed everything I thought I knew about survival? My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what happened on March 15th, 1943, in a place where hope went to die. This is the story I've never told anyone, not my children, not my grandchildren, not even myself, until now. The morning started like any other in Block 7 of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the same metallic taste of fear in my mouth, the same hollow ache in my stomach that had become as familiar as breathing. But something felt different that day, though I couldn't name it then. My father was beside me on the wooden plank we called a bed, his breathing shallow and labored. Mama had been moved to the women's barracks 3 weeks earlier. My little sister Sarah had been taken on arrival. I refused to think about where. The capo's whistle shrieked through the barracks at 4 a.m., just like always. But when I looked at Papa's face, I knew. His eyes had that glassy look I'd seen too many times before, the look that meant goodbye. "Listen to me, David," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the chaos of men being forced from their bunks. "Promise me something." I leaned closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. Around us, hundreds of skeletal figures stumbled toward another day of hell. But in that moment, there was only Papa and me. "There's something I never told you about our family," he said, pressing something small and hard into my palm. "Something your grandfather made me swear to keep secret until... His voice trailed off as a guard shouted nearby. I looked down at my hand. It was empty. But I could still feel the weight of whatever he'd given me, as if it had burned itself into my skin. "Papa, what are you talking about?" I whispered frantically, but his eyes were already closing, and I knew, God help me, I knew this was our last conversation. The selection came at noon. Dr. Mengele stood at the center of the yard like a conductor preparing for a symphony of death. Left meant work, right meant the chimneys. I'd seen this dance 100 times, but never with my entire world hanging in the balance. They brought the women from the other side first. I scanned every face, searching desperately for Mama's familiar features among the sea of shaved heads and hollow cheeks. Then I saw her. She was thinner than I remembered, her clothes hanging on her frame like fabric on a scarecrow. But those were definitely her eyes, still carrying that spark of defiance that had driven Papa crazy and made me proud to be her son. Our eyes met across the yard, just for a second, just long enough for her to mouth 3 words that would haunt me forever. "Find the music." Find the music. What music? There was no music here. There was only death and desperation and the sound of jackboots on gravel. Mengele's finger pointed right. Mama disappeared into the crowd of the condemned. Then came the men. Papa could barely stand when they dragged him from the infirmary. I wanted to run to him, to hold him up, to somehow transfer what little strength I had left into his failing body. But the guards formed an impenetrable wall between us. When Mengele's eyes fell on Papa, there was no hesitation. Right, always right for the sick ones. But as Papa shuffled toward his fate, something extraordinary happened. He began to sing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant, it was barely audible over the sounds of boots and barked orders, but I heard it. A melody I'd never heard before, haunting and beautiful and completely impossible in this place of death. Other prisoners began to turn their heads. Even some of the guards paused. The song seemed to wrap around the yard like an invisible thread, connecting every broken soul to something larger than their suffering. And then Papa looked directly at me and smiled. Actually smiled, as if he'd just solved a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. "The music, David," he called out, his voice suddenly clear and strong. "Remember what I told you, find the music." Those were his last words to me. That night, alone in a barracks full of strangers, I tried to understand what Papa had meant. I pressed my fingers against my palm where he'd placed that invisible gift, and suddenly I could feel it again, not an object, but a presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the song he'd sung. The melody came back slowly, note by note, until I could hear it as clearly as if he was singing beside me. That's when I realized Papa hadn't given me an object at all. He'd given me a memory. I was 8 years old again, sitting in our kitchen in Krakow while Papa's father, my grandfather, taught me an old Jewish lullaby. But not just any lullaby. One that had been passed down through our family for generations, he'd said. A song that carried the souls of our ancestors. Music lives in the spaces between the notes. Grandfather had told me, is weathered fingers moving across an invisible keyboard. When everything else is taken from you, the spaces remain. And in those spaces, we survive. I hadn't understood then. But lying on that wooden plank, surrounded by death and despair, I finally got it. The next morning brought news that shattered what remained of my world. The women from yesterday's selection were gone. All of them. Mama was gone. I should have broken then. Any reasonable person would have. I had nothing left, no family, no future, no reason to take another breath in this hellscape. But instead of despair, something else flooded through me. The melody Papa had sung was growing stronger in my mind, and with it came voices. Not real voices, not real voices. I wasn't losing my mind, but the echo of everyone who had ever sung that song before me. My grandfather's voice, teaching me the words when I was small. My great-grandfather's voice, singing it to his children during the pogroms in Russia. Voices stretching back through centuries of persecution and survival, all connected by this one impossible thread of music. And I understood Papa's gift at last. He hadn't just given me a song. He'd given me a chain of continuity that stretched back through generations and forward into a future I couldn't yet imagine. Every time someone in our family had faced annihilation, they'd carried this music with them. And now it was my turn. But the most impossible part was yet to come. 3 days after losing my parents, while working in the sorting warehouse where prisoners' belongings were catalogued, I made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the lining of an old coat was a small leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with musical notation, dozens of songs, melodies, and compositions written in a careful hand. My hands trembled as I opened the first page and saw the inscription, "For my grandson David, who will carry our music into tomorrow. Your loving grandfather, Moses Goldstein, 1928. This was impossible. Grandfather had died when I was 10, years before we were taken to the camps. How could this notebook be here? But as I flipped through the pages, I found something that made my blood run cold and my heart soar simultaneously. There, written in grandfather's familiar script, was the exact melody Papa had sung in the yard, the same song that had been growing stronger in my mind every day since. At the bottom of the page, in letters so small I almost missed them, was a message. The music lives in the spaces between the notes. When you sing this song, we all sing with you. You are never alone, David, never alone. I want you to understand something about that moment. I was a skeleton wrapped in skin, working 18-hour days in a place designed to erase every trace of human dignity. I was surrounded by people who would kill me for an extra crust of bread. But holding that notebook, I felt more alive than I had in months. Because suddenly I understood what Papa had been trying to tell me. The music wasn't just a song or a memory or even a connection to the past. It was proof that something in us could survive anything. Something that couldn't be burned or beaten or starved out of existence. Love. That's what survived. Love disguised as music, hidden in the spaces between despair and hope. From that day forward, I sang that song every night. Silently so the guards wouldn't hear. But in my mind, it rang out clear and strong, and every time I sang it, I could feel them all with me. Papa, Mama, little Sarah, grandfather, and all the others who had carried this music before me. The other prisoners began to notice a change in me. Not just in my spirit, though those had mysteriously lifted, but in my body. I was lasting longer on work details, surviving on rations that were killing stronger men, getting through selections that claimed prisoners in much better condition. The guards noticed too. They started calling me St. Jude, the singing Jude. They never heard me make a sound, but somehow they knew. And here's the thing that still gives me chills 78 years later. I wasn't the only one. Word spread through the barracks in whispers. Other prisoners started approaching me, asking if I knew songs from their own families, their own traditions. And incredibly, impossibly, I found that I did. Not because I'd learned them, but because when I sang my family's song, it somehow opened a channel to all the songs that had ever been sung in defiance of hatred. Russian lullabies, Polish folk songs, German hymns, Hungarian love ballads, they all seemed connected by the same invisible thread. Soon, I had a network of survivors who met in the shadows, sharing not just songs but the stories that came with them. We became a secret symphony of resistance, using music to preserve not just our own sanity, but the memory of the world they were trying to erase. The guards never figured out what was happening. They saw prisoners who should have been dying instead becoming stronger, more resilient, harder to break. They called it impossible. We called it survival. The most incredible moment came 6 months later, during what would be my final selection. I was down to maybe 90 pounds, my body finally starting to give out, despite the strength I'd been drawing from the music. When Mengel's eyes fell on me, I knew this was it. The finger would point right, and I would join my family in whatever came next. But as I stood there, waiting for the verdict, something unprecedented happened. I started to sing, out loud. Not the whispered version I'd been carrying in my mind, but the full melody, with words in Hebrew that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. The entire yard fell silent. Hundreds of prisoners, dozens of guards, even Mengele himself stopped what they were doing and listened. The song filled the space between the barracks and the sky, transforming that place of death into something else entirely. And in that silence, I heard them, all of them, Papa's voice joining mine, then Mama's, then Sarah's, then Grandfather's, and behind them a chorus of thousands stretching back through generations. We were all singing together, the living and the dead, and for those few moments the camps couldn't touch us. When the song ended, Mengele did something no one had ever seen him do before. He hesitated, left, the finger pointed left. I lived, but more than that, I lived with the absolute certainty that I would never be alone again. No matter what happened, no matter where life took me, I would always carry with me this invisible orchestra of everyone who had ever loved me. The war ended 8 months later. I weighed 83 pounds when the Americans liberated our camp, but I walked out on my own feet, singing softly under my breath. I came to America, started a family, built a life. I never spoke about the camps to my children. How could I explain something so incomprehensible? But I taught them the song, and they taught it to their children. The music continues. Today, at 97 years old, I have great-grandchildren who carry that melody in their hearts without knowing its history. They sing it as a lullaby to their own babies. The same notes that once defied the machinery of genocide, now soothing the next generation to sleep. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my memories, I can still hear all of them singing with me. Papa and Mama, Sarah and Grandfather, and all the others who didn't make it out but whose love somehow did. That's what saved me in the camps. Not luck or strength or even determination. It was love disguised as music, hidden in the spaces between despair and hope, passed down through generations and forward into a future that hatred could never destroy. The Nazis took everything from me, my family, my youth, my innocence, my faith in humanity. But they couldn't take the music. They couldn't silence the love. I'm telling you this story now because the world seems to be forgetting. We're losing the survivors, and with them, the living memory of what happens when hatred goes unchecked. But the music doesn't have to die with us. Every time you choose love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation, you're adding your voice to the chorus. You're carrying the song forward into spaces where darkness thought it had one. That's what Papa was trying to tell me in those final moments. That's what Mama meant when she said find the music. They weren't talking about melody or rhythm or harmony. They were talking about the indestructible force that connects every human heart to every other human heart across time and space and circumstance. The thing that makes us keep singing even when all the reasons for song have been taken away. The music lives in the spaces between the notes, and in those spaces, love survives everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of love to survive the unthinkable, please subscribe to top_life_stories, because these aren't just stories, they're proof that no matter how dark the world gets, there's always music waiting to be found.